on a cold, silent night. A young mother stepped out of her small cabin, holding the hand of her little girl. The snow was falling softly, the wind was sharp, and both of them were trembling. But they kept walking, because staying meant danger, and leaving was their only hope. The child pressed her doll to her chest, her cheeks red from the cold, her eyes full of fear and trust. And on that lonely mountain road, they met a man riding slowly through the storm, a tired cowboy, a man who carried his own sadness, his own mistakes. He could have passed them by, but something in that moment called him to stop. Maybe kindness, maybe fate, maybe God's gentle hand guiding him. What happened next was not just a rescue, but the beginning of a story about courage, healing, and the quiet way broken lives can find light again. Before we begin, may I ask you gently, where are you watching from tonight? Let's see how far this story of hope and God's protection can reach. Snow fell in slow, heavy sheets over the Colorado mountains, softening the sharp lines of the pine ridges and swallowing the narrow wagon road in white. The little Carter homestead, one sagging cabin, a leaning shed, a half-frozen corral, sat alone under a moonless sky, its single window glowing faintly like a tired eye that refused to close. Inside, the warmth stopped just short of the farthest corners. Emily Carter stood by the iron stove, one hand braced on its edge, the other pressed to the swelling on her cheek. She was 28, with dark blonde hair twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, strands pulled free by rough hands and tears. Her face had once been the kind that looked younger when she smiled. Round cheeks, soft brown eyes that crinkled kindly at the edges. But she hadn't smiled much in years. There were fine lines now between her brows, carved there by worry and sleepless nights. Her dress, a faded blue calico, bore a dark smear where Derek's hand had shoved her against the table. The wood still vibrated in her memory with the impact, though the room was quiet now except for the pop of the fire and the wind clawing at the cabin walls. Behind her, perched on a three-legged stool, sat Lily. Lily Carter was 7, small for her age, all elbows and knees beneath a too short brown wool dress. Her hair, lighter than Emily's, almost corn silk, had been braided that morning, but one braid had come loose hanging crooked over her shoulder. She clutched a ragged cloth doll to her chest, the doll's button eyes slightly uneven, the yarn hair stitched in with the clumsy care of a child. Lily had made it herself from scraps in an old flour sack Emily had given her, and she guarded it the way some girls might guard a treasure chest. Her gray eyes, too old for such a young face, were fixed on the man sprawled on the bed. Derek Carter lay half sideways across the straw mattress, one boot still on, one boot off, and dropped somewhere under the bed. He was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered from years in the silver mine, his dark beard thick but poorly kept, like a field left to go to seed. When he was sober, there had once been charm in his crooked grin and bright blue eyes. Now those eyes were closed, lashes resting on cheeks flushed red from whiskey, and his open mouth let out a sour, rhythmic snore. The bottle that had brought them to this moment lay on its side near the bed, a trickle of liquor still bleeding into the cracks between the floorboards. Emily kept her voice low, as if afraid the walls themselves might tattle. "Lily, she whispered, not turning around. "You all right, baby?" Lily nodded once, a small, stiff motion. She did not say she was all right. She rarely said anything after nights like this. He'd come home early from the mine, boots slamming up the steps, coal dust still in the lines of his hands, temper already burning hot. Someone had cheated him at cards, or the foreman had cut his hours. It hardly mattered. The bottle came out, the words started, and when Emily tried to take Lily into the other room, his hand had caught her wrist. "Bad enough you make me look like a fool," he had slurred, "without turning my own house against me." The back of his hand across her face had sent her stumbling into the table, Lily's sharp cry cutting through the air like a bird's. That cry, more than the pain, had brought Emily back to herself. Now, hours later, Derek's rage had burned out and left him in a stupor. Emily lifted her fingers from her cheek and stared at the faint smear of blood on her palm. Something in her settled into place. Not hard and cold, but strangely clear. "If I stay," she thought, "he finishes what he started. Maybe not tonight. Maybe on a night when the snow is thicker and no one can hear us scream." She turned to Lily. "We're going for a ride," she said softly. "Do you remember how we practiced packing quick for pretend adventures? This time, it won't be pretend." Lily's fingers tightened on the doll. She looked at Derek, then back to Emily, as if measuring the danger with those quiet gray eyes. Finally, she nodded again. Emily moved quickly but carefully. She pulled the old canvas bag from the peg by the door, the one she'd told Derek she kept in case of fire, and he'd laughed at. Into it she folded 2 dresses for Lily, 1 extra shift for herself, wool stockings, a tin of salve, a hairbrush, a battered tin box holding her marriage certificate and Lily's birth record, and a small cloth purse with the pathetic handful of coins she'd managed to squirrel away from grocery trips. Her hand hovered over the framed photograph on the shelf, herself and Derek on their wedding day, faces young and hopeful. She left it. That girl was gone. "Put on your shawl," she murmured to Lily, "and your boots. Quiet as mice." The cabin seemed to hold its breath as they moved. Floorboards that usually creaked kept kindly still under their feet. Derek snored on, sprawled like a drunken bear, one arm flung out toward the empty space where his wife should have been. At the peg by the door hung Lily's small gray cloak. Emily wrapped it around her daughter, pulling the hood low over her hair, then shrugged into her own heavy brown coat. It had patches on the elbows and 1 mismatched button, but it held the warmth in. She eased the door open. Cold struck her like a slap, clean and sharp. The air smelled of snow and pine and distant wood smoke from other scattered homesteads tucked among the hills. Above, the sky was a black bowl dusted with faint stars, blurred by the thick curtain of falling flakes. Their horse, Jasper, stood in the small corral, snow already settling on his back. He was a big bay gelding with a patient eye and a white star on his forehead, getting on in years but still strong enough to pull their wagon to town and back. He snorted softly when he saw them, as if in question. Emily stroked his nose, fingers numb. "Easy, boy," she whispered. "One more favor." She hitched Jasper to the small farm wagon, the one with the uneven wheel and the cracked seat. The wood creaked as she tightened the traces, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. Lily clambered up onto the bench, clutching her doll, watching with solemn concentration. When everything was as ready as she could make it, Emily climbed up beside her daughter, gathered the reins, and spared one last look at the cabin. The window glowed weakly. For a heartbeat, she saw not the prison of the last few years, but the first winter there. Derek laughing as he tried and failed to fix the leaking roof, Lily a baby in her arms. For a moment, grief stabbed her. She gripped the reins until her knuckles whitened. "Giddy up," she said. Jasper leaned into the harness, and the wagon rolled forward onto the narrow, snow-choked road. They followed the track that wound around the shoulder of the mountain. The snow was falling harder now, flakes driven slantwise by a wind that tasted of ice. The iron-rimmed wheels cut grooves into the white, sometimes slipping on hidden ruts. The lantern, hanging at the wagon side, swung, throwing jolting circles of light on the road ahead. Lily huddled close, pressed into Emily's side. Every so often she would look back over her shoulder, as if expecting Derek to come pounding up the road with a shotgun. Seeing nothing but darkness, she would tuck her chin back into her cloak, breath puffing little clouds. "How far are we going?" Lily asked at last, voice thin. "As far as we need to," Emily answered. "There's a town on the other side of the pass, Silver Ridge. They've got a church, maybe a place for women like us." She said it as if she believed it. She'd heard whispers in town of a mission that sometimes took in widows and orphans. She was neither, not yet, but she was desperate. Maybe that counted. The road grew steeper, hugging the side of a ravine. Pines loomed on the uphill side, their branches bowing under the weight of snow. Below, the darkness dropped away into a tangle of rocks and shadows. Emily clucked to Jasper. "Just a bit more, boy." The wagon hit a hidden rut. There was a sharp crack, a sickening lurch. Emily's stomach dropped as the back corner of the wagon jolted violently. Jasper stumbled, snorted, then stopped. For a heartbeat, everything went utterly still, as if the whole mountain was listening. Then the world tilted. Emily grabbed Lily, pulling her close as the wagon bed slumped to one side. The left rear wheel had splintered clean through, the spokes shattered under the strain and the cold. The wagon listed helplessly, its load throwing off its balance. Emily jumped down into the snow. It swallowed her boots almost to the ankle. She staggered to the back, heart hammering, and saw the damage clearly in the lantern's swinging light. The wheel was ruined. They weren't going anywhere in that wagon tonight. Panic rose in her throat, bitter and hot. "We'll walk," she murmured, more to herself than to Lily. "We can walk." But she looked ahead at the narrow road vanishing into white, and back at her daughter's pale face, and the words turned to ash. The snow was already past Lily's ankles on level ground. On a mountain pass, in the teeth of a storm, a 7-year-old wouldn't last long. Neither would she, perhaps. For the first time since they'd left the cabin, Emily felt truly alone. The night seemed to press in on them, the wind's howl rising, the trees creaking like old bones. There was no glow of another homestead, no jingle of approaching harness, no sound but the weather and their own breaths. Lily's small hand slid into hers. "Mama," she whispered, Are we still going away?" Emily forced herself to kneel in the snow so she could look her daughter in the eye. Snowflakes landed in Lily's hair, clinging like tiny stars. "Yes," she said firmly, "we're not going back. Even if I freeze to death out here, we are not going back." She rose and was about to start unfastening Jasper, thinking they might at least ride double on his back, when she heard it. The distant, rhythmic crunch of hooves over packed snow. Emily's heart leapt into her throat. For an instant, terror painted Derek's face in her mind, sobered by rage, riding hard after them. She grabbed Lily and tugged her toward the tree line. "Hide," she hissed. "Behind those rocks. Quick." They scrambled off the road, snow dragging at their skirts. Emily pushed Lily down behind a jut of granite and crouched in front of her, trying to make her own body a shield. The sound of hoofbeats grew nearer, joined by the faint creak of wooden wheels and the jingle of harness rings. Through the curtain of fallen snow, a shape materialized. A single rider on a sturdy chestnut horse, pulling a small two-wheeled cart, its canvas cover dusted and white. The rider drew rein when he spotted the crippled wagon and the lone horse steaming in the cold. He was a tall man, wrapped in a dark wool coat that had seen better days, the collar turned up against the wind. His hat, a wide-brimmed brown felt, was crusted with snow along the edges. As he pushed it back slightly, Emily could see his face in the lantern light, a lean, sun-browned face with high cheekbones, a strong jaw roughened by several days' growth of beard, and a thin white scar running from the corner of his right eyebrow down toward his temple. His eyes, a clear gray, moved over the scene with the wary quickness of someone used to danger. This was Jake Walker, though Emily did not know his name yet. Jake was around 35, his frame long and wiry from years in the saddle. The way he sat, his horse spoke of long marches and bad trails, balanced and ready. There was a tiredness in the set of his shoulders, a weight that did not come from the bedroll lashed behind his saddle or the wooden chest in the back of his cart. He carried himself like a man who had seen too much in too short a life and hadn't yet decided what to do with the years ahead. He clicked his tongue softly, and the chestnut horse stopped beside the broken wagon. Jake scanned the area, frown deepening. "Hello there," he called over the wind. His voice was low with a rough western drawl and the faintest ghost of military command in its cadence. Somebody in trouble? Emily hesitated. If she stayed hidden and he rode on, they would be alone again, with a broken wagon, a tired horse, and a child in a worsening storm. She stepped out from behind the rocks. "We're here," she said, her voice hoarse. "Our wheels snapped." Jake's head turned quickly toward her. His eyes narrowed, taking in her swollen cheek, the thinness of her coat, the little girl half hidden behind her skirts clutching a rag doll. He swung down from the saddle with an easy, practiced motion. Up close, Emily could see more details: the frayed cuffs of his coat, the patched knees of his trousers, the worn leather of his boots. This was not a wealthy rancher passing by. This was a man who lived on the road. And yet, at his belt, secured in a well-kept holster, was a revolver whose metal gleamed even in the poor light. On the cart behind him, under the canvas flap, she glimpsed an old wooden ammunition box, a bundle of tools, and what looked like a small black-covered book with edges worn white, perhaps a Bible thumbed in restless nights. "You picked a hell of a night to be out on a pass, ma'am," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. His gaze flicked to Lily, then back to Emily. "Name's Jake Walker." "Emily Carter," she replied automatically, "and this is Lily." Jake tipped his hat slightly toward the girl. "Evening, Miss Lily." Lily's grip on the doll tightened. She stared at him, eyes wide, but said nothing. Jake shifted his weight, crunching snow beneath his boots. "You headed somewhere particular, Mrs. Carter? Or just away?" The question was gentle, but it cut close. Emily swallowed. "Silver Ridge," she said. "If we can make it. I heard there's help there." Jake looked at the broken wheel, then at the sky. The snow was thicker now, the wind sharper, cutting across the pass. "You won't make town in this," he said quietly. "Not with a busted wagon and a little one on foot. Storm's just getting started." He glanced back down the road the way he'd come, then up toward the darker line of trees higher on the slope. "There's an old hunting cabin about a mile off the pass," he said finally. "Belonged to a trapper I knew. He's been gone a few years. Roof still held last time I checked. I can get you there. We can ride double on my cart, lead your horse behind. Get a roof and a bit of fire between you and this weather." Emily's instinct, burned into her by too many bad nights, screamed not to trust another man. But then she looked at Lily, whose lips were beginning to turn a pale bluish color, and at Jasper, whose sides steamed with exertion. They would not survive the night on the road. She lifted her chin. "We'd be grateful," she said, "if it's no trouble." Jake's mouth twitched, the ghost of a humorless smile. "Lady," he said, shaking his head, "trouble's what happens if I ride on and pretend I didn't see you." He moved with brisk efficiency then, unhooking the lantern from Emily's wagon and tying Jasper's lead rope to the back of his cart. He helped Lily up first, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted her onto the narrow wooden seat. She flinched at his touch, but he pretended not to notice. "Hold on tight to your mama," he told her. Then he offered his hand to Emily. For a heartbeat, her fingers hovered in the cold air, the decision like a cliff edge beneath her. Finally, she placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused, the grip firm but not crushing. He steadied her as she climbed up beside Lily, then swung back into his saddle, taking up the reins. "Keep low," he warned. "Wind bites worse up that way." They turned off the main pass onto a barely visible track that slanted uphill through the trees. Snow whispered against the canvas cover of the cart, hissed through the pine needles, whirled around them in frantic white spirals. After what felt like far longer than a mile, a squat shape emerged from the darkness between the trees, a small log cabin with a crooked stone chimney, half buried in snow. Its single door sagged a little on its hinges, and the window beside it was dark, the glass rimmed with frost. Jake dismounted and trudged through the drift to the door. He shouldered it open with a grunt and disappeared inside for a moment. When he came back, he carried a bundle of old firewood and a rusted lantern. "Still dry enough," he said. "Come on, let's get you two warm." Inside, the air was stale with dust and old smoke, but it was shelter. The cabin was one room, a rough table, a couple of crude bunks, a stone hearth with a stack of pine logs beside it. Wind whistled faintly through the gaps between the logs, but the walls still stood solid against the storm. Jake struck a match, the tiny flame flaring in the dimness, and lit the lantern. The yellow glow pushed back the shadows, catching on the motes of dust in the air. He knelt at the hearth, coaxing life into the cold ashes until a small, stubborn flame caught the kindling and began to grow. Emily stood just inside the doorway, Lily pressed against her side, both of them shivering as melted snow dripped from their coats onto the rough plank floor. The light from the lantern painted their faces in soft gold and deep shadow. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters and sighing through the chinks in the walls. Inside, a fragile pocket of warmth began to form around the newborn fire. For the first time since she'd stepped out of her cabin, Emily let herself breathe. They were not safe. Not yet. But they were not alone in the snow anymore. And for tonight, that was enough. For a long moment after the fire caught, no one spoke. The flames licked up around the split pine logs, snapping and hissing, throwing a wavering orange glow across the single room. Shadows jumped on the log walls, stretching and shrinking with every flicker, making the cabin feel both larger and smaller at once. Emily stood near the door with her back against the rough wood, her body still half turned toward the outside, as if ready to bolt. Her coat hung open now, steam rising faintly from the damp wool. Beneath it, the outline of her thin frame was more obvious, the dress hanging looser than it ought to on a woman her age. She watched Jake move around the hearth with the careful attention of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust a stranger's kindness too quickly. Jake knelt in front of the fire, adding another log and setting a blackened kettle on the iron grate. The movement made his coat hitch up, and as he shifted, the lantern light fell across the back of his neck where the collar gaped. There, half hidden by sun-darkened skin, was a long, pale scar that ran from just behind his ear down towards his shoulder, thicker at one end, like something that had torn more than cut. Another, thinner line traced along his left forearm where the sleeve was frayed, a white snake curling beneath the dark hair. They were old wounds, the kind that came from steel and flame rather than farm accidents. "You can come closer," he said without looking up, his voice quiet. "Fire won't bite, long as you don't stick your hand in." Lily edged forward first. The fear in her eyes hadn't vanished, but the promise of warmth was stronger. She was shivering so hard now that her doll bounced in her arms. Emily followed more slowly, every step a measured decision. She kept herself between Jake and her daughter, even as she moved nearer the hearth. Jake reached into the cart box he'd dragged inside and pulled out a bundle of wool blankets, folded but worn thin in places. "Ain't hotel grade," he said, a corner of his mouth lifting, "but they're clean and warmer than good intentions." He held one out to Emily. She hesitated just long enough to be noticed, then took it with a mumbled, "Thank you." Her fingers brushed his knuckles. Brief contact, skin against skin. His hand was rough and dry, scarred over the knuckles, but his grip loosened the instant she had hold of the blanket, like he wanted no claim on her beyond the offer. He dug again in the box and came up with a dented tin with a faded label, then another and a small canvas sack. "Corned beef," he said, tapping one tin. "Beans in the other. And this," he loosened the tie on the sack enough for the smell of flour and salt to drift out. "Biscuit fixins if I can find enough patience left in these hands to bake 'em." Emily's stomach clenched at the scent. She hadn't eaten since midday, and even then it had been the heel of a loaf and a thin smear of lard. Lily swallowed audibly. "You don't have to feed us," Emily said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You've done enough bringing us here." Jake shrugged, reaching for the small folding knife on his belt and popping the seal on the corn and beef. "Man eats alone. He hears his own thoughts too loud," he replied. "Figure I'd rather listen to cutlery on tin." He sliced thick, greasy pieces onto a cracked plate and set it on the table, then used the corner of his coat to wipe dust from 2 tin cups before pouring water from a jug into the kettle. The motions were practiced, efficient, the kind of unconscious ritual of someone used to making something out of not much. Lily watched him the way a skittish colt might watch an unfamiliar hand, fascinated and ready to bolt. When he caught her eye and nudged the plate toward her, he did it slowly, like approaching that colt. "Ladies first," he said. Emily tore a piece in half, gave the larger portion to her daughter, and only then let herself taste the other. The meat was salty and tough, but to her it might as well have been a feast. Warmth spread from her mouth down to her chest, chasing some of the cold out. As the fire grew, she unbuttoned her coat the rest of the way. The lamplight fell on her wrists where the sleeves of her dress had ridden up. Finger-shaped bruises had already begun to bloom there in sickly blue and purple, stacking over faint yellow ghosts of older marks. She caught sight of them and quickly tugged her sleeves down again, but not before Jake's gaze flicked there and back. He didn't comment. Instead, he busied himself with the biscuits, mixing flour and water and a pinch of salt in a wooden bowl he found on a shelf, working the dough with his hands as if he'd done it 100 times before. His silence was not the heavy, punishing kind Emily knew too well. It was something looser, as if he was leaving space for her to speak if she chose. Outside, the wind rose, flinging snow against the chinked logs in soft thuds. The cabin creaked, a long, tired sigh, but held firm. After the biscuits were set in a makeshift pan near the coals and the kettle began to hiss, Jake wiped his hands on a rag and finally spoke again. "You got people in Silver Ridge?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the fire. Emily shook her head. "No kin, just heard." She paused, testing the words before releasing them. "Heard there was a church, that sometimes they help folks in trouble." "There's a church," Jake said. "White clapboard, steeple too short for its own pride. Reverend's a man named Lucas Harlan. Gray hair, round in the middle like he swallowed his Bible instead of read it, but he's got a decent heart. Talks too long, but I'd rather a man talk too much about mercy than not at all." The picture of Reverend Harlan formed easily. A man in his late 50s, heavy around the waist from too many potlucks and too little farm work, with soft brown eyes that wrinkled up at the corners when he smiled. Emily imagined him standing at a pulpit in a plain black coat, hands calloused not from fighting, but from years of turning thin pages and shoveling snow off church steps. A man who believed rules mattered, but people mattered more. "Would he take in someone like us?" Emily asked quietly. "A woman who left her husband, a child?" There was something like shame tangled in the words, though she'd done nothing wrong but survive. Jake looked at her then, really looked, his gray eyes steady. "He's buried 3 wives who died with bruises no one talked about until after the coffin lid closed," he said. "If there's any man in that town likely to slide pews aside to make room on the floor for a mother and her girl, it's Lucas." Emily swallowed hard and nodded. The thought of a room, any room, where Derek's boots had never stamped, where she didn't have to listen for the creak of the porch that meant he was home and drunk, felt like some far-off miracle. Time blurred after that. The fire crackled, the biscuits baked, the kettle sang. As the worst of the chill left their bones, weariness crept in to take its place. Lily's head drooped, jerking up every time she almost nodded off. "Reckon the little one's about done in," Jake said. He stood and crossed to one of the bunks, shaking out an old straw mattress and throwing one of the blankets across it. It ain't feather beds and lace, but it beats a wagon bench. Emily led Lily over, helping her crawl onto the bunk. The straw rustled under her slight weight. She still clung to the cloth doll, its rag body smudged with soot from the wagon ride. "You can sleep, Lily," Emily murmured, tucking the blanket up to her daughter's chin. "I'll be right here." Instead of answering, Lily reached for the small cloth sack Emily had used for flour at home. It had somehow made its way into the canvas bag in their haste, one corner still dusted white. The girl fished out a stub of pencil from her dress pocket, cracked and tiny from overuse. "Not now, honey," Emily started, but Lily shook her head and began to draw on the blank side of the sack, the pencil whispering against the coarse fabric. Lines emerged in her small, sure strokes: a little square house, a sloping roof, smoke curling from a chimney. In front of it, 3 stick figures, a tall one, a shorter one, and a little one between them. No dark scribbles for broken bottles, no jagged lines for shouting. When she turned the sack for her mother to see, her eyes were shining in the firelight. Emily's throat closed. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Lily's lips moved as if to say something, but the words never made it out. Instead, she hugged the sack to her chest like a promise and lay back. Sleep pulled her under quickly. For a while, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of burning wood and Lily's soft, even breathing. Emily sat on the edge of the bunk, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. The bruises on her wrists seemed to throb in time with her heart. Jake sat back down by the fire, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames as if they held some answer he'd misplaced. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the crude wooden shutter over the lone window. The sudden bang of it slamming in its frame made him flinch. The reaction barely there, but sharp. His hand went automatically to his side, fingers closing on empty air where a rifle should have been. His whole body went rigid, eyes gone distant, unfocused. In his mind, the wind was not wind. It was the crack of gunfire echoing through jungle heat, the snap of bamboo, and the high, terrible cry of a man hit where he couldn't be saved. For a heartbeat, he was back in 1906, in the tangled green of the Philippines, stumbling over roots as bullets sang past his ears and the world turned to smoke and screams. He smelled blood and cordite, heard the thud of a body falling beside him, saw a young private's eyes staring up at the sky in disbelief. "Jake?" Emily's voice reached him from a long way off, soft but steady. "It's just the shutter, the wind." He blinked, the cabin walls snapping back into focus. The logs, the fire, the woman with fear and grit both drawn into the lines of her face. Not jungle, not war. He exhaled slowly, hand dropping away from his side. "Yeah," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Wind. She likes to holler some nights." Emily watched him for a moment. She recognized that look, the sudden absence, the way a person's gaze went through the room instead of resting on it. She'd seen it in the mirror after the worst beatings when Lily called Mama twice before the word stuck. "You were a soldier," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jake's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Once," he replied. "Uncle Sam packed me up and shipped me to the other side of the world. I brought some of it back with me, against my will." He tapped his temple lightly. "Things don't always stay where you leave 'em." Silence stretched between them. Not unpleasant, just full. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Emily looked down at her hands again, turning them palms up, then palms down, studying the bruises as if they belonged to someone else. The lamplight made the marks stand out like ink on parchment. "He started with shouting," she said at last, her voice so soft he had to lean in to hear. "Said the mine made him tired. Said I didn't understand pressure. First time he hit me, he cried after. Bought me a ribbon from the general store, said it would never happen again." She gave a small, mirthless laugh. "Should have known that was a lie when he picked the brightest red they had. He liked how it looked against my throat." Jake said nothing. He simply listened, jaw tight, hands folded, loosely, every inch of him still. "It got worse after Lily was born," Emily went on. "He didn't like her crying. Didn't like me forgetting things 'cause I was so tired. And every time I thought of leaving, I remembered the church ladies whispering about that widow in town who couldn't keep a husband. I remembered my ma saying, 'You made your bed, Em. Now you lay in it.'" She raised her eyes to his, and he saw something fierce burning there beneath the exhaustion. "Tonight, I decided I'd rather Lily remember a mother who ran than a mother who stayed and died." Jake's throat worked around words he didn't quite let fall. He understood debts and promises, understood guilt like a stone in the gut. But this was a different kind of battlefield. "You made the only choice that made sense," he said finally, "far as I can see." Her gaze flicked toward the shutter as the wind hit it again, lighter this time. "Doesn't feel like sense. Feels like jumping off a cliff and hoping there's water at the bottom." Jake looked at Lily's sleeping form, at the small hand curled around the cloth doll, at the flour sack drawn clutched to her chest. "Sometimes jumping's the only way not to get buried where you stand," he said. "Silver Ridge ain't heaven, but that church, it's a start. Lucas can't fix every hurt, but he can stand between you and a man who thinks his fists are scripture." Emily let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The thought of someone standing between her and Derek, someone the law might listen to, felt like the first step on ground that didn't tilt under her feet. "Tomorrow," she said, almost to herself, "if the storm lets up, we'll go." "We will," Jake agreed, surprising himself with the certainty in his own voice. He had been drifting so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to point his boots at a place on purpose. "I'll see you there." She looked at him sharply. "You don't have to." "I know," he cut in gently. "Can't say I've got much use for pews and sermons, but I know roads, and I know men like your Derek. Figure that gives me some use until you're under a roof that ain't likely to cave in." Their eyes held for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them. Not trust, not yet, but the outline of it. Outside, the wind howled and then began, very slowly, to ease. Inside the little cabin, the fire burned steady. Emily lay down on the other bunk, boots still on, blanket pulled up to her chin. Jake kept his place by the hearth, shoulders bowed slightly as he stared into the coals. Sleep came in ragged fits to both of them, broken by half-remembered shouts and distant gunfire only they could hear. But each time Emily woke, the glow of the fire was still there, and the shape of Jake's back was still a solid line between her and the door. For one night at least, they were held together by 4 rough walls, a shared warmth, and the fragile hope of a church in a town they hadn't yet seen. By morning, the storm had spent most of its fury. The trees still wore heavy white coats, and drifts piled high against rocks and stumps, but the sky above the pines had lightened to a pale, washed-out blue. Breath steamed from Jasper's nostrils as Jake checked the harness one last time and helped Emily and Lily up onto the seat of his cart. The little girl's eyes were ringed with shadows from a thin night's sleep, but there was a spark there now, the stubborn flame of someone who'd seen a picture of a better life and decided it might be real. "Silver Ridge is a couple hours if the road behaves," Jake said, swinging into the saddle of his chestnut and clicking his tongue. "You'll see the church steeple before you smell the mine, which is one point in its favor." The track down off the ridge was narrow and rutted, but the snow there was thinner, beaten back by wagons and hooves. As they descended, the world widened, pine forest thinning into scrubby hills, then giving way to a shallow valley. Smoke columns marked where other homesteads huddled against the cold, and in the far distance a faint gray smudge of town rose at the base of a low mountain, Silver Ridge itself. By the time they rolled onto the main street, the day had brightened fully. Silver Ridge wasn't big, but it carried itself like a place that had seen more trouble than its size deserved. A single, dusty street, now mostly mud and slush, ran between two rows of buildings. A general store with fading paint, a blacksmith shop with its door wide and a hammer ringing faintly inside, the sheriff's office with a narrow-fronted jail attached, a clapboard church with a squat steeple that looked almost embarrassed beside the tall mountain behind it. And on the corner, closest to the mine road, stood Maria's place. The sign over the door read, "Gonzalez Boarding House and Eats," in hand-painted letters, the Z's a little fancier than the rest, as if whoever made it couldn't resist showing off. The building itself was 2 stories of weathered wood, the lower level fronted by big windows fogged over from the warmth inside. The smell of coffee and fried onions drifted out whenever the door opened. A couple of miners in stained shirts and suspenders leaned on the railing out front, tin cups in hand, staring over the rims as Jake's rig rattled past. Silver Ridge was a place where new things were noticed. Heads turned as they came up the street. Women in shawls paused on porches. A boy unloading feed at the livery stopped in mid-lift. 2 elderly men playing checkers outside the general store forgot their game entirely. A woman with a basket on her arm, Mrs. Pettigrew, who prided herself on knowing every birth, death, and misstep in a 20-mile radius, tilted her head and narrowed her eyes. "Who's that with Jake Walker?" she murmured to her companion. "Looks like trouble found him a skirt." Jake felt the weight of the stairs but kept his gaze forward. He was not a stranger to suspicion. His coat still carried dust from eastern roads, his accent softened by travel, but not entirely of the West. Folks here called him that drifter from back east when they thought he couldn't hear, and sometimes when they knew he could. He guided the horse to a stop in front of Maria's boarding house. "You'll eat better here than anywhere else in town," he said, dismounting. "And if anybody's got an extra bed or a scrap of floor to spare, it's Maria." The door swung open before he could knock. Maria Gonzalez filled the doorway like a small, fierce storm. She was in her late 30s, a compact woman with strong shoulders and hips built from lifting cast-iron skillets and crates of potatoes for half her life. Her skin was the warm brown of someone whose grandparents had crossed borders before maps cared to notice, and her black hair was twisted into a bun at the back of her head, held in place with two metal combs shaped like tiny silver horses. Dark eyes, sharp and bright, missed nothing. She wore a flour-dusted apron over a deep red dress, and there was a smear of something, possibly gravy, possibly war paint, along her forearm where she'd wiped her hands mid-cooking. Lines at the corners of her mouth hinted that she could smile wide, and just as easily press her lips into a line sharp enough to cut gossip short. "Walker," she said, folding her arms as she leaned against the door frame. "You bring me business or trouble?" "Bit of both, most likely," Jake replied. "Maria, this is Emily Carter and her girl, Lily. They could use a meal and some quiet." Maria let her gaze travel over Emily. The thinness under the coat, the fade-in bruise at the cheek that no winter air could explain, the way she stood half in front of her daughter without seeming to think about it. Then she looked at Lily, whose boots didn't quite match, and whose little hands gripped the rag doll like it was the one thing the world couldn't pry away. Something softened in Maria's posture. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You look like the wind's been chewing on you since last year." The warmth inside hit them in a gentle wave. The boarding house dining room was long and narrow, lined with mismatched tables and chairs. A big iron stove sat in the corner, its belly glowing, a kettle ever steaming on top. Against one wall was a faded sofa where, at this early hour, no one yet snored. The air hummed with the low murmur of miners finishing late breakfasts, spoons clinking on plates, the occasional burst of laughter as someone told a story bigger than the truth. Maria's place was the kind of spot where stories grew taller with every retelling, a hub where men fresh from the shaft compared injuries and wages, where drifters like Jake traded news from other towns, where a woman could find out half the town's business by refilling coffee cups and simply listening. She shooed Jake, Emily, and Lily toward an empty table near the stove. "Sit. I got stew left from the night crowd and bread that's still got some fight in it. You pay when you can, or you wash dishes if you can't. Nobody stares at an empty plate at my tables." Emily opened her mouth to protest, pride rearing up, but the smell of the stew, rich and savory, hinting of beef bones and onions and something sharp like bay leaf, robbed her of words. Lily slid onto the bench without waiting for permission, eyes fixed on the pot Maria was already ladling from. Jake hovered by the table edge, unsure if he should sit. Maria glanced at him. "You too, Walker. You look like you've been eating soldier rations again." He gave a small shrug and took the chair opposite Emily. As bowls and thick slices of bread landed in front of them, conversations around the room shifted. The miners tried not to stare openly, but their voices dropped. There was something to talk about now beyond ore quality and broken tools. The stranger woman, the child, the drifter who'd brought them in. "That him?" A young miner with straw-colored hair whispered to his companion. "That's the eastern fella. Heard he don't stay in one place more'n a week." "Yeah," the other muttered. "And now he's bringing women out of the snow. Nothing but trouble, that look." Maria heard it. She always did, but for the moment she let it slide. Gossip was as much a currency as cash in a place like this, and sometimes you had to let it spend itself before you could knock it down. As Emily ate, some of the color crept back into her face. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, the constant flinch easing just a little. Lily finished her bowl quickly, then began tracing patterns in the condensation on the side of her cup, small finger making loops and lines that looked suspiciously like little houses and trees. The door opened again, letting in a gust of cold air and a young woman with ink-stained fingers. Clara Finch stepped inside, shaking snow from the brim of her small hat. She was in her mid-20s with a narrow, thoughtful face and hair the color of wheat pulled back into a bun that was already working itself loose. A pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose, slightly crooked from being pushed up too often. Clara taught at the town's one-room school, a building tucked behind the church with a stove in the middle and 12 desks that had seen more initials carved into them than lessons written. She had a way of looking at children as if they were puzzles she was delighted to solve, and a way of looking at adults that said she'd already solved them and wasn't overly impressed. "Mornin', Maria," she called, unbuttoning her coat. "I've got 3 boys betting the creek's frozen solid enough to skate on, and I need something hot in 'em before they test their theories." "You feed 'em and send 'em to church," Maria said. "Let the Reverend pray extra skin on their knees." Clara laughed, then noticed Emily and Lily. Her expression changed, curiosity and concern knitting her brows. "New faces?" "Emily and her little one, Lily," Maria said, not pausing in her work, "coming out of the storm with Walker." Clara moved closer, softening her smile as she approached Lily's side of the table. "Hello there," she said. "I'm Miss Finch. I teach the school just down the street. We've got 11 troublemakers and 1 angel who pretends not to be. That makes 12 students in total. Think we might have room for 1 more?" Lily's grip tightened on her cup. She picked up at her mother, seeking permission. Emily felt something twist in her chest. A school. A place with desks and slates and someone whose voice didn't rise in anger by day's end. "She doesn't talk much," Emily said quietly, "but she's bright, loves drawing." Clara's eyes lit. "Good. Half my boys think reading is torture and arithmetic's a crime. I could use someone in the room who likes quiet." She looked at Lily again. "If you'd like to come by tomorrow, just to look, you can sit by the window and draw while we work. No pressure." Lily gave the smallest nod. Clara smiled as if she'd been handed a gift. "That's settled then," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She moved off to harangue the miners' boys, leaving a seed planted behind her. Outside the boarding house, the town's peace was fraying. Back at the Carter homestead, hours earlier, Derek had woken with a mouth like cotton and a head full of pounding drums. For a few groggy heartbeats, he'd thought the silence meant blessed solitude. Then he realized it was too quiet. No clatter from the stove, no soft murmur of Emily's voice, no light footsteps of Lily moving about. "Em," he'd called, swinging his legs over the bed. No answer. The cabin door stood ajar, snow blown in across the threshold. The peg where Emily's coat usually hung was empty. So was the hook for Lily's cloak. Outside, the wagon tracks scarred the snow, heading down the road, then veered off toward the pass where the wheel had broken. Derek Carter was a big man with thick arms from swinging a pick and shoulders broadened by years underground, but fear hollowed his chest when he understood what the empty hooks meant. Fear, then anger. It rose hot and fast, burning away memory of his own fists and words from the night before. "She's gone crazy," he muttered, breath smoking in the cold air as he saddled his horse with clumsy hands. "Taking my girl out in weather like this, She's lost her damn mind." He rode hard for town, spurring the horse more than it deserved. By the time he reached Silver Ridge, his face was set in the grim mask of a man who'd decided on his story and would cling to it. Sheriff Tom Harding looked up from his desk as Derek shoved open the office door. Tom was in his late 40s, tall and broad in a way that had gone a little soft around the middle but still carried weight. His hair, once black, had silver threading through it now, and deep lines etched their way from the sides of his nose to the corners of his mouth, a map of every argument, every long night. He wore a plain brown vest over a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, badge pinned almost as an afterthought to his chest. His eyes were a clear hazel, usually calm, but they sharpened at the sight of Derek's stormy entrance and the sour reek of whiskey that drifted in with him. "Mornin', Derek," Tom said, setting down his pen. "To what do I owe the noise?" "My wife's gone," Derek snapped, packed up the girl and ran out in the middle of the damn night. "You gonna sit there and scratch paper, or you gonna do something about kidnapping?" Tom leaned back in his chair slowly. "Kidnapping is a big word," he said. "Last I checked, a mother leaving with her own child is called leaving." Derek's jaw clenched. "She ain't right in the head, Tom. You know that. Talks to herself, jumps at shadows, said the walls were closing in. She's unstable, and you've seen how she coddles that girl. If she takes her off God knows where in this weather, they'll both end up dead in a snowbank. Then where will you be?" Tom had, in fact, heard some raised voices from the Carter place on more than one night when he'd been out making his rounds. He remembered riding by once, seeing Emily's silhouette in the window, shoulders hunched, and deciding to keep his horse moving because there was no law in the books that let him walk in and arrest a man for being mean and stupid. He also remembered Derek's bar tab and the stories the miners told when the man wasn't around, about a temper that spilled over from cards to fists, about a wife who showed up to town less often than she used to, and always with long sleeves no matter the heat. "You sayin' she's a danger to the child?" Tom asked carefully. "I'm sayin' she's out of her mind," Derek insisted. "Says I'm the problem. Me. I work 12 hours a day down that shaft, and this is the thanks I get. She's poisoned that girl against me. You gotta bring 'em back. I'm her husband. I got rights." Tom rubbed a hand across his jaw, feeling stubble he hadn't yet shaved. The law was clear enough on some things. A man had standing in his home, a father had claims to his child. But there was another law in Tom Hardin's personal ledger, one that said a sheriff had to sleep at night with the choices he made. "I'll keep an eye out," Tom said finally. "If I see Emily and Lily, I'll talk to 'em. Make sure they're safe. Make sure they know you came looking." "That's it?" Derek demanded. "You're not going to ride out now?" Tom's gaze hardened just a hair. "Storm only just let up. Roads are a mess. If they've made it this far, they're likely in town or headed for it. Me tearing around like a fool ain't going to help." Derek swore under his breath, pacing once across the cramped office. "You always take the side of crazy women?" "I take the side of facts," Tom replied. "And the fact is, Emily's never caused me trouble. You, on the other hand." His eyes flicked to the bruised knuckles on Derek's right hand, the reddish scrape along one finger. "You sober up proper and come back this afternoon. We'll talk more if I've heard anything by then." It wasn't the answer Derek wanted, but the badge on Tom's chest carried weight Derek wasn't quite ready to push against. Not yet. He left in a huff, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. Later, as the sun slid lower and shadows stretched along the street, Sheriff Hardin found himself standing on the boardwalk outside Maria's place. He had a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, and his shoulders hunched against the lingering chill. Through the window, he could see a scene that didn't match Derek's story at all. A tired woman with wary eyes, a little girl tracing shapes on the table, and Jake Walker sitting like a man caught between staying and riding on. Tom had his doubts about Jake, about anyone who never stayed long enough to grow roots, but he'd never seen him raise a hand in anger, and he'd never heard a child cry when the drifter was near. The sheriff took a slow sip of coffee, watching the three of them, and felt the tug of war between the official complaint on his desk and the picture in front of his eyes. For now, he decided he would watch. He would listen. He would talk to Reverend Lucas and Maria and maybe Miss Finch before he let Derek Carter's version of the truth become the only one stamped with the law's seal. In Silver Ridge, words traveled faster than any train, and tonight the story of the strange woman, her child, and the drifter who'd brought them in would circle town twice before dark. But behind the muttered speculation and sideways glances, lines were quietly being drawn, some on paper in the sheriff's ledger, some in the hearts of people who had seen enough hurt to recognize it when it walked through their door. The trouble came back to them on horseback. Late afternoon light slanted down Silver Ridge's main street, turning the slush in the ruts to strips of tarnished silver. Inside Maria's boarding house, the lunch rush had thinned. A few men lingered over coffee, voices low, chairs tipped back. Emily was at a corner table with a borrowed mending basket, trying to earn her keep by sewing loose buttons on Maria's stack of shirts. Lily sat beside her, a scrap of paper in front of her, and a stub of pencil in hand, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she drew. Jake leaned against the door frame between the kitchen and dining room, sleeves rolled, helping Maria by drying plates as she washed. It was a quiet, almost normal moment, the kind that made Emily's muscles forget for a few precious seconds that they were used to flinching. Then hooves thundered outside, too fast for a town street. The noise made Lily's pencil jump, streaking a jagged line across her drawing. Jake's shoulders tensed, dish towel freezing in his hand. Maria glanced up, eyes narrowing. Before anyone could move, the front door slammed open hard enough to make the bell above it shriek. Derek Carter filled the doorway like a black cloud. His coat was half-buttoned, dark hair disordered, cheeks flushed with cold and anger, and the lingering burn of drink. Snow clung to his boots and the hem of his coat, melting into small puddles as he stepped inside. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room. "Emily," he barked, voice already too loud for the space. "You get yourself out here right now." Conversation died mid-sentence. Chairs scraped as a couple of miners straightened, ready to watch the show. Maria set a plate down with deliberate care and stepped out from behind the counter, but Jake was already moving. Emily had gone rigid at the first sound of his voice. The needle in her fingers slipped, pricking her thumb. A bead of blood welled up, bright against her skin. Lily's hand crept under the table to clutch her mother's skirt. Jake put himself between Derek and their table, the motion smooth but decisive. "Afternoon, Carter," he said, voice flat. "You're tracking snow on Maria's floor." "This ain't your business, Drifter," Derek snarled. You think bringing my wife into town makes her yours?" His gaze slid past Jake, latching onto Emily like a hawk spotting something small and fragile. "Pack your things, Em. We're going home. You've caused enough embarrassment for one day." Emily's throat tightened. The room blurred at the edges. She heard Maria suck in a breath beside the counter, heard a chair creak as someone leaned forward to see better. She swallowed. "I'm not going back, Derek." Her voice came out thinner than she wanted, but the words held. The color in Derek's face darkened. "You lost your mind," he spat. "Running off with my daughter. Folks are already talking. You want them to think you're some kind of—" "You finish that word in here," Maria cut in, stepping forward, "and I'll pour yesterday's grease in your boots." Her hands were on her hips, apron still wet from dishwater, eyes snapping. "This is my place. You keep a civil tongue or you take yourself outside." Derek's lip curled, but he didn't test Maria's patience. Instead, he shifted his fury back to Jake, who had not moved an inch. "Move aside," he said. "She's my wife. I got every right to take her home." Jake shook his head once. "You got the right to ask," he replied. "She's got the right to say no. Seems you heard her." Derek took a step closer, close enough that the sour tang of whiskey reached Jake's nose. "You'd think you're some kind of hero," he hissed. "Picking up another man's crazy wife on the side of the mountain? You don't know what she's like." Jake's jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. A flash of a different place, different shouting, uniforms instead of work shirts. He forced it back down. "I know I saw a woman and a child freezing to death in a broken wagon," he said. "That was enough." Behind him, Lily's pencil scratched again, faster now. Her small hand moved in urgent strokes over the paper, sketching the outline of a doorway and a man standing in front of it, broad shoulders, straight back, between the viewer and some unseen threat. She pressed harder, the pencil tip leaving a dark, protective silhouette. Derek saw the movement, saw the way his daughter angled the paper away from him, and something jagged cracked inside his expression. "Look at this," he said, voice rising. "She's turning my own girl against me, drawing you like some damned guardian angel." His hand twitched, half starting toward the table. Jake caught the motion and stepped to block it, his voice dropping low. "Careful," he warned. "You lay a hand on that child in here and you'll answer to more than just me." For a moment, Derek looked ready to swing. His shoulders bunched, fists curling. The room held its breath. One of the miners muttered, oh," under his breath. The door opened again. "Afternoon, folks," Sheriff Tom Harding said. His tone was mild, but his eyes took in the scene in one swift glance. Derek's posture, Jake's position, Emily and Lily pale and pressed together at the table. Maria standing like an artillery piece behind her counter. "I heard raised voices halfway down the street. Figured I'd see if someone needed reminding which building sells liquor and which one sells stew." "Good timing, Sheriff," Maria said, not taking her eyes off Derek. "Your timing is getting better. Maybe next week you'll walk in before my floorboards feel like they have to jump out of the way." Derek rounded on Tom. "You know why I'm here," he snapped. "You said you'd do something. Instead, you let this vagrant hide my family from me." Tom set his hat on a peg, unhurried. "Nobody's hiding," he said. "They're sitting right there, woman and child, eating their first decent meal in a while, far as I can see. You want to talk about rights, we can talk. You want to drag anyone out by the hair, that's another conversation." "They're mine," Derek said. "My wife, my girl." "And they're also people," Tom replied evenly, "which means they get to talk too. Emily?" He looked at her directly. "Do you want to go back with your husband?" The room seemed to tilt. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct honed over years told her to duck her head, say, "Yes, Sheriff," and hope the beating that followed at home would be brief. Derek's glare drilled into the side of her face. She forced herself to look at Tom instead, at his calm, steady gaze. She thought of Lily's picture of the quiet house, of Jake's promise by the fire, of Maria's hand on her shoulder last night when she'd whispered, "You're safe under my roof as long as you need to be." "No," she said. Her voice shook, but the word was clear. "I don't." Tom nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. He turned back to Derek. "There you have it." "So that's it?" Derek exploded. "You take her side? She's crazy, Tom. She hears things. Says I'm a monster in front of my own child. You're gonna just let her wreck my family?" Tom's jaw flexed. "I'm gonna keep the peace," he said. "And right now, peace looks like you walking out that door before we give Maria cause to test that frying pan on your skull." A ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. Maria hefted the large iron skillet in her hand meaningfully. Derek glared at each of them in turn. Jake, Tom, Maria, Emily, then spun on his heel and stormed out, the bell on the door jangling frantically in his wake. The sound of his boots on the boardwalk faded, replaced by the murmur of voices rising again. Tom let out the breath he'd been holding. "Well," he said, "that went about as well as it could have, considering." He glanced at Emily. "I can't keep him from filing papers at the courthouse, Mrs. Carter, but I can sure as hell keep him from dragging you out of a public place by force." Emily nodded, throat too tight to speak. Jake's shoulders eased, the tension draining from his stance. He caught Lily's eye and offered a small, reassuring smile. The girl hesitated, then held up her drawing for him to see. The man in her picture stood solid in front of a door, arms slightly out as if ready to push back whatever came. Behind him, in quick lighter strokes, were two smaller figures, one with the triangle of a dress, one tiny and round. Safe. Jake swallowed, something in his chest twisting. "You're quite the artist, Lily," he said softly. That night, Derek did not go home. Anger and humiliation drove him to the Broken Pick, the saloon at the far end of town where lantern light was dim and the air thick with smoke and old beer. The sign over the door swung in the wind, the painted pickaxe on it chipped and worn. Inside, a piano in the corner stumbled through a tune, half the keys out of tune or broken. Hank Dobbs, a barrel-chested miner with a flattened nose and a permanent bruise blooming on one cheek, leaned against the bar. He was the sort of man who laughed loud, hit hard, and rarely thought more than 2 minutes ahead. Beside him sat Lou Porter, a wiry, sharp-faced card player whose fingers moved as if they were always shuffling something, even when they were empty. "Carter," Hank boomed as Derek shoved up to the bar. "You look like the mine caved in on your head." "Wife run off," Lou said with a thin smirk. "Heard about that already. News travels fast, friend." Derek slammed his palm on the bar. "She didn't run," he growled. "She was lured. That drifter, Walker, he thinks he can steal what's mine and the sheriff will just stand there polishing his badge." Hank chuckled. "Sheriff's soft. Always has been. Talks more than he shoots." Lou's eyes gleamed with interest. "What you gonna do about it?" Derek took a long pull from the glass the bartender slid his way, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm going to make the law work for me," he said. "If Hardin won't do his job, the judge will. Emily's always been nervous, talks to herself, jumps at shadows. I'll get it on record, say she's not fit to raise a child. Then they'll have to give Lily back to me." Lou whistled softly. "You start using words like unfit and unsound. That's hard to climb out of." Derek shrugged, smile thin and mean. "That's her problem. She wanted to make me the villain? Fine. I'll show her what happens when you paint a man with horns." He spent the rest of the evening there, drinking and grumbling, feeding his anger until it felt like righteousness. By the time he staggered out into the cold, the plan had rooted itself in his head as truth. He wasn't cruel. He was correcting a wrong. The next morning, with a hangover pounding behind his eyes, he presented himself at the small office that served as Silver Ridge's link to the county seat. A narrow room with a high counter and a wall of shelves full of ledgers. Behind the counter sat Mr. Avery, the town clerk. A thin, balding man in his 40s with a neatly trimmed mustache and ink stains on his cuffs. He lived for neat handwriting and orderly lines, for dates and signatures that made the world feel containable. "How can I help you today, Mr. Carter?" Avery asked, adjusting his spectacles. "I want to file a petition," Derek said, rolling the word around like it tasted useful. "My wife's gone, unwell, took my daughter. I need the court to recognize she's not fit, that she's not in her right mind." Avery pursed his lips, pulling out a blank form. "These are serious allegations," he said. "The judge will require examples, incidents." Derek had them ready, or thought he did. He spoke of nights Emily cried in the kitchen, of times she jumped when he came through the door, how she kept Lily too close, wouldn't let her play outside when he wanted her to. He called it paranoia and hysteria, dressed up in words he'd heard in town. He left out the whiskey bottles and the bruises. Avery's pen scratched across the paper, turning Derek's version of events into ink and legal lines. Each stroke built a case he didn't see from the other side, a weapon aimed not just at Emily's freedom, but at her sanity in the eyes of the law. By noon, the petition was signed, stamped with a small official seal, and slotted into a folder that would travel with the next mail wagon toward the county judge. While Derek twisted truth into tidy columns, another kind of truth was stirring a few miles away. On the edge of town, Mrs. Grace Holloway stood on her porch, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, watching the road that led from the Carter place. Grace was in her early 60s, a thin woman with wispy gray hair pulled into a bun that never quite stayed put, and bright blue eyes that had seen more than they ever let slip. A widow of 10 years, she lived alone in a small house with a sagging roof and a yard full of stubborn rose bushes that she coaxed into blooming each summer. She had watched Derek stagger home late more nights than she could count, heard his shouting drift across the snow, heard the sharp crack of something breaking and the muffled sob that followed. She had opened her door once to find Lily standing there in the dark, night-dress thin, shivering, saying nothing but looking at the light like it was a miracle. Grace had wordlessly wrapped a shawl around the girl's shoulders and walked her back, telling Derek she wandered, kids do, though they both knew better. Now, hearing gossip about Emily running off crazy and taking the child, Grace felt her jaw set. She might be small and older, but there was iron in her spine. If someone asked, she decided she would tell the truth, loud enough that it might matter. That evening, in the storage room behind Maria's boarding house, another confession found its way into the air. The space smelled of old straw, soap, and the faint tang of onions stored for the winter. Emily sat on an overturned crate, Lily asleep on a pile of folded blankets nearby, one arm thrown over her face. The faint light of a single lantern softened the harshness of the rough wooden walls. Jake sat across from Emily, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. His hat lay on the floor beside him. The lines around his eyes looked deeper in the lantern glow, shadows collecting in the hollows of his cheeks. "You're not the only one who's run," he said quietly. Emily looked up, startled. "From what?" "From himself," he answered. "From what he's done." His gaze dropped to his hands, the scars there pale in the yellow light. "I told you I was in the army. That wasn't the whole of it." She waited, saying nothing, sensing he needed the space. "In '06, my captain got word of an insurgent camp in the hills," Jake began, voice flat at first, then roughening. "Said there were men there responsible for ambushes. 2 patrols lost in a month. He wanted revenge, and he wanted it public. Make an example." He swallowed, eyes distant. "I knew the terrain. I'd scouted those paths. He asked me to lead the men before dawn. Said we'd catch them sleeping. I told myself I was just following orders, that someone else would go if I said no." The lantern hissed softly. Emily's hands curled in her lap. "We came in quiet," Jake said. "Guns ready, hearts pounding. I remember thinking it all felt too easy. Campfires cold. No sentries out that I could see. Then the shapes started to separate in the half-light, and I realized the reasons were smaller than they should have been." His voice dropped. "There weren't insurgents in that camp, just families. Women, old men, kids who'd been moved there after the real fighters cleared out." He stared at the floor now. "Someone fired anyway. Maybe a nervous trigger, maybe an excuse. Doesn't matter. Once one shot goes, the rest follow. By the time the captain got control, there were bodies on the ground who'd never held a gun in their lives." Emily's breath caught, a hand rising to her mouth. "I led them there," Jake whispered. "My map, my path, my voice saying, 'This is the place.' You don't walk away from that clean." "What happened after?" she asked, barely audible. "They wrote it up as an unfortunate mistake," he said bitterly. "Collateral damage, wrong camp, right message." He huffed out a mirthless laugh. "The captain got a reprimand in his file. I got transferred, but I still see their faces when a shutter bangs in the wind. I still wake up some nights hearing a mother screaming in a language I don't know, but understanding every word." He finally looked at her. "So, when I saw you and Lily out there in the snow, part of me saw them too, the ones I didn't save, and I thought, maybe I get one thing right before they put me in the ground." Silence wrapped around them like another blanket. The house creaked as it settled. Somewhere out front, Maria laughed at some customer's joke, the sound muffled but warm. Emily studied Jake's face, the guilt etched there, the way he carried his shoulders as if under invisible weight. She thought of how she'd stayed silent for years, convinced no one would believe her over a husband with steady pay and an easy smile. how her own fear had bound her to the man who hurt her. "We both believe the wrong people," she said softly. "You believed orders were always right. Believed my husband's temper was always my fault." He gave a small, broken half-smile. "Fear's a good liar," he said. "And silence is its best friend," Emily replied. For a moment, their shared understanding sat heavy and strangely comforting between them. Two people from different wars, both carrying scars others couldn't see. "Maybe," she said slowly, "this is where we stop being quiet." Jake nodded, eyes steady on hers. "Reckon you're right, Mrs. Carter." In the dim light of Maria's storeroom, with Lily breathing softly nearby and the snow beginning to fall again outside, Emily realized something. They were both, in their own ways, survivors of battles no one had written down. And for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone in hers. The snow fell soft that morning, not like a storm, but like the sky was reminding Silver Ridge it still held the power to hush everything if it chose. Flakes drifted down through a pale gray light, settling on hats and shoulders, muffling the clatter of wagon wheels outside the town hall. Inside, the long meeting room had been turned into a rough courtroom. Someone had dragged the county's heavy oak table to the front and set a chair behind it for the judge. Three mismatched chairs formed a sort of witness stand, and a line of benches, borrowed from the church across the street, sat in two rows facing forward. They filled quickly. Miners in work coats with caps clutched in their hands, shopkeepers in Sunday vests, women with shawls pulled tight around their shoulders. Everyone found a reason to be there. In a small town, a hearing about a woman leaving her husband was as much spectacle as justice. Emily sat near the front on a hard bench, fingers knotted tightly in her lap. She wore the best she had, a dark wool dress Maria had pressed for her, mended at the cuffs, and a borrowed shawl draped over her shoulders. The fading bruise on her cheek had yellowed at the edges. She hadn't bothered to hide it. Lily sat pressed against her side, clutching her fabric doll so tightly the little stitched face was almost swallowed by her small fingers. Her hair had been brushed smooth by Maria that morning, ribbons tied in careful bows that trembled whenever she moved. Maria herself sat on Lily's other side, solid as a stone wall. The flour had been scrubbed from her hands, and she wore a dark blue dress today instead of her usual apron. But nothing could soften the line in her jaw or the way her eyes scanned the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Jake occupied the bench behind them, hat resting in his hands, fingers tracing the brim over and over. He had shaved, or at least done the best he could with a dull razor and cold water, and his hair was combed back. The clean white shirt under his worn coat made him look almost respectable, if one ignored the tension in his shoulders and the way his gaze kept tracking toward the door. Sheriff Tom Hardin leaned in the back corner near the door, arms folded, badge catching the lantern light. Mrs. Grace Holloway sat upright on the far aisle, back straight despite her years, lips pressed together, eyes sharp. At last, there was a murmur near the front as the door behind the big table opened and the judge walked in. Judge Robert Langley was a man in his late 50s, tall, but beginning to stoop at the shoulders from years of bending over papers and ledger books. His hair was silver, combed carefully back from a high forehead, and he wore a neatly trimmed mustache that had once been black but now matched his hair. His eyes, a pale blue, were keen and tired at the same time. The eyes of someone who had seen more foolishness and cruelty than he liked, but was still determined to sort through it as best he could. He wore a dark suit, vest straining just a little at the middle, and a plain black tie. No wig, no robe. This was a frontier court, not some marble hall back east, but his presence carried authority all the same. He took his seat behind the table, shuffled a few papers, then looked up at the room. The low buzz of conversation died away like someone had drawn a curtain. This hearing of the district court for Clear Creek County is now in session, he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried. We're here in the matter of Derek Carter's petition regarding the mental fitness of his wife, Emily Carter, and the custody of their daughter, Lily Carter. He glanced down at his papers, then up again. We will hear from the petitioner first. Derek stood near the front, beside an empty chair. He looked like he'd been poured into his Sunday best. His dark coat was brushed, his boots cleaned, his hair combed so severe the line of parting cut like a knife. A clean shirt and tie gave him a softer look, almost respectable. He held his hat in both hands, knuckles white, but when he turned toward the room, his face shifted into something almost wounded. Mr. Carter, Judge Langley said, you may speak. Derek cleared his throat, lowering his eyes just enough to suggest humility. Thank you, Your Honor, he began. I'm just a working man. I dig in the mines. I ain't good with words like some. He paused, letting that image settle. But I know my wife, or I did, and I know something ain't right with her no more. His gaze flicked toward Emily for the briefest moment, then back to the judge. She's been not herself, he said, since the baby was born, really. Jumpy, nervous, seeing things wrong, saying I'm dangerous to her when all I ever did was work myself near to death to keep a roof over their heads. He let the words hang heavy. She'd sit up nights, talking to herself in the kitchen. Won't let Lily out of her sight, like the world's out to snatch her. When I come home tired, she looks at me like I'm the enemy. His voice roughened at the edges, borrowing the sound of hurt. Then, 2 nights back, she up and bolts in the middle of a snowstorm. Takes my little girl out in weather that would kill a grown man. No note, no word, just gone. That ain't the thinking of a sound mind, Your Honor. That's someone who needs help. And in the meantime, my daughter's caught up in it. I'm asking the court to see that, to keep Lily safe until her mama gets set right again. He finished and lowered himself into his chair with a sigh, wiping at his face like a man fighting tears. A few people in the back shifted. Someone murmured, "Poor fella." Judge Langley watched him, expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he said. "Mrs. Carter, would you please come forward?" Emily's heart stuttered. Her legs felt numb as she stood. Maria's hand squeezed her wrist, once solid, reassuring, then let go. She walked to the front, skirts whispering against the wood floor, and sat in the chair facing the judge. Lily's eyes followed her, wide and anxious. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, "you've heard your husband's testimony. Do you dispute his account?" Her mouth was dry. For a moment, no words came. The room felt too small, packed with eyes and judgment, and the memory of every time she'd tried to speak and been cut off with a shout or a slammed fist. But Jake's voice from the night before came back to her. Fear's a good liar, and the look in his eyes when he said it. And beneath that, a quieter memory. Miss Finch's gentle question to Lily about school. Maria's firm, "You're safe under my roof." She swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. Her voice shook, but the sound carried. "I do." Langley nodded slowly. "Tell me your side, then." Emily took a breath, feeling her ribs expand against the tightness in her chest. "My husband works hard," she began. "That part's true. The mine takes pieces of him. Comes home with dust on his clothes and tired in his bones." She paused. "But the whiskey takes more." A faint rustle went through the benches. Derek's jaw clenched. "He started drinking more 3 years ago when the mine cut hours for a spell," Emily said, eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance to keep from collapsing under Derek's glare. "At first, it was just talk and shouting, words so loud Lily would wake up crying. Then dishes started breaking, chairs, once it was a window." Her fingers twisted in her lap. She forced them to still. "After that, it was me." She raised her left sleeve slowly, exposing the yellow-green bruise circling her upper arm like a half-faded rope. A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Grace sat even straighter. "This was 2 weeks ago," Emily said quietly. "He grabbed me because I wouldn't hand him the bottle back. Said I was treating him like a child." She swallowed. "He hit me across the face once when I stepped between him and Lily. It wasn't the only time, but it was the one that made me decide to leave." Her voice strengthened on the last words, surprising even herself. "I stayed because I was afraid," she said. "Afraid no one would believe me. Afraid they'd say I was ungrateful, that I was crazy. He told me that enough times I almost believed it." She lifted her chin, finally meeting the judge's gaze. "But I'm not crazy, Your Honor. I was scared. For myself. For my child." She glanced toward Lily then, and the little girl straightened under her gaze. "When the wheel broke on the pass, we almost froze," Emily continued. "If Mr. Walker hadn't come by, you'd be holding a burial today instead of a hearing. I didn't take Lily into that storm because I lost my mind. I took her because staying meant waiting for the day he'd lose his completely, and there'd be no one there to stop him." Silence settled over the room. No one shifted now. Even the air felt like it was listening. Judge Langley sat back, fingers steepled in front of him. Whatever he'd expected to hear, this was more complicated. "We're going to hear from some witnesses," he said at last. "Mrs. Gonzalez?" Maria stood and walked to the front, skirt swishing, chin lifted. Up close, the faint scars on her knuckles were visible, old burns from ovens, or perhaps older battles. "State your name for the record," Langley said. "Maria Gonzalez," she replied. "I run the boarding house and cafe on Main." He nodded. "You've had Mrs. Carter and her daughter in your care these past 2 days?" "I have," Maria said. Her voice carried easily. "They came in half frozen and scared. Emily's cheek had a fresh bruise. Her arm looked like someone had tried to wring it off. She flinched every time the door opened." She turned slightly, looking at the benches. "People in this town know what a woman looks like when she's just clumsy and what she looks like when someone at home's using her for a punching bag." Someone in the back snorted agreement. "And Mr. Carter?" the judge asked. "What's your impression of him?" Maria's mouth tightened. "Pays his tab late, drinks fast, talks louder the emptier the bottle gets," she said. "I've seen him slam his fist on my bar so hard the glasses jumped. I've seen Lily come in barefoot once in winter, shivering, like she'd run from the house. Emily came in after, eyes red, saying it was a misunderstanding. But the girl didn't look like she misunderstood anything." Derek muttered something under his breath. Langley shot him a warning glance. "Thank you, Mrs. Gonzalez," he said. "You may sit." "Mrs. Holloway?" Grace rose, smoothed her skirt, and made her way forward with the careful steps of someone who knew the weight of every eye on her but refused to hurry for any of them. She stated her name, then folded her frail hands in her lap. "I live next to the Carters," she said, "close enough to hear most everything that happens after dark." She didn't embellish, simply laid down facts in a steady, measured tone. The late-night shouting, the curses hurled, the crash of breaking furniture. The one night Lily appeared on her porch, barefoot and shaken. "I walked her back," Grace finished. "Told Derek she'd wandered, but the next morning I saw Emily at the pump, moving slow like every bone hurt. Don't need a doctor's schooling to know what that means." By the time Sheriff Tom came forward, Derek's polished image of the wounded husband was showing cracks. Tom testified quietly, hands loose at his sides. "I've broken up 2 of Mr. Carter's fights at the saloon in the past year," he said. "Both times he'd been drinking hard. I've heard raised voices from their place, enough that I rode by some nights slower than others." "And when Mr. Carter came to you?" the judge asked, "saying his wife had taken their child and lost her wits?" "I told him I'd look into it," Tom replied, "which is what I'm doing now. But what I've seen here in town doesn't match the picture he painted me in that office." Finally, Judge Langley turned to Jake. "Mr. Walker?" Jake stood, smoothing his coat with one hand, hat in the other. He walked to the front like a man approaching an open cliff edge, every step measured. "Name?" Langley asked. "Jacob Walker," Jake said. His voice was low but clear. "Most folks just say Jake." "You found Mrs. Carter and her daughter?" "Yes, sir," he said. "On the mountain road 2 nights ago. Wagon wheel broke, snow coming in hard. They were cold enough that if I'd come an hour later, I might have found bodies instead." His fingers tightened on the brim of his hat. "I got them to shelter, then brought them into town at first light. That's all." "Is it?" the judge asked mildly. "I understand you were present at an altercation at the boarding house yesterday." Jake's throat worked. His eyes flicked once toward Lily. She was watching him, doll pressed to her chest, half hiding behind Maria. Derek's gaze had turned hard as flint. "I was there," Jake said. "Mr. Carter came in shouting, tried to force Mrs. Carter to leave with him." His voice steadied as he spoke. "She said no. He got closer anyway. I stepped between them. If the sheriff hadn't walked in when he did, I reckon we'd have finished that conversation with our fists." A faint, nervous chuckle rippled through the room. "I ain't claiming to be a hero, Your Honor," Jake went on. "I've made my share of bad calls, but leaving that woman and child out there on their own in that weather would have been one more. I've had enough ghosts follow me already." He stopped there. The room felt his words hang heavy with something unsaid, but no one asked. Judge Langley leaned back, letting the testimony settle in his mind like snow on branches. Outside the big front windows, flakes drifted past, lazy and soft. Inside, the air seemed to hold its breath. "All right," he said at last. "I've heard enough for today." He picked up his pen, rolled it once between his fingers, then set it down. When he spoke again, his words were measured. "This court finds no evidence that Mrs. Emily Carter is of unsound mind," he said. "On the contrary, I find her actions, while risky, to be the actions of a woman trying to protect herself and her child from a pattern of escalating violence. A hush dropped over the benches. Derek's hands curled into fists on his knees. "Effective immediately," the judge went on. "Temporary custody of Lily Carter is granted to her mother, Emily Carter. Mr. Derek Carter is ordered to have no contact with either until this court rules otherwise. That means no visits, no following them into town, no lurking outside doorways in the dark. If you want the law on your side, Mr. Carter, you'll start by obeying it." Derek surged half out of his chair. "You can't." Langley's gaze sharpened. "Sit down, sir." The quiet steel in his tone cut through Derek's protest. Slowly, Derek sank back. "This is not a permanent ruling," the judge continued. "If, in future, Mr. Carter can demonstrate sustained sobriety and control of his temper, testimony from the sheriff, from his employer, from the community, this court will consider a petition to revisit custody arrangements. I don't take a child from her father lightly, but I won't leave her where I believe she's at risk." He picked up his gavel, a simple block of wood nicked with use, and struck it once on the table. The sharp crack echoed through the room. "This hearing is adjourned." People began to move, voices rising in low, excited waves. Some shot Derek sympathetic looks. Others avoided his eyes entirely. A few women glanced at Emily with a mixture of curiosity and something like respect. Lily pressed herself into Maria's side as Derek's glare swept across the room. His eyes found his daughter, and for a second the anger there was raw enough to make her shrink back behind Maria's skirt. Doll squashed between them. Maria shifted, blocking his line of sight without even looking his way. Jake exhaled slowly, realizing only then that he'd been holding his breath for the judge's whole ruling. His hand shook as he jammed his hat back on his head. Emily stood on uncertain legs. She felt drained, hollowed out, and yet oddly weightless. For the first time since she could remember, she had spoken the full truth in front of others, and the world had not collapsed on her head for it. Sheriff Tom moved through the crowd to Derek's side, one hand resting lazily near his holster. "You heard the judge," he said quietly. "You come near them, we'll have a different kind of talk. You understand me?" Derek didn't answer. His jaw was so tight the muscles stood out along his neck. With a harsh exhale, he turned and pushed his way toward the door, snow swirling in as it banged shut behind him. Emily gathered Lily into her arms, feeling the small heartbeat against her own. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but something inside her had shifted. The storm she'd lived in for years had, at least for now, been named and pushed back by the simple weight of her own voice. She met Jake's eyes across the room. He gave her a small nod. No swagger, no heroics, just quiet acknowledgement. She had saved herself as much as anyone else had saved her. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she and her daughter would have a chance to decide what came next. By the time the snow finally gave up its grip on the valley, Silver Ridge had almost forgotten the sound of its own laughter. In the spring of 1910, the mountains still wore white on their highest peaks, but lower down the slopes were streaked with damp earth and the pale green of new grass. Meltwater ran in busy silver ribbons along the ruts of the main road, and the air smelled of wet pine and wood smoke instead of coal dust and cold. For Emily, the change in the weather matched something quieter that had been shifting inside her for months. The boarding-house kitchen had become her new world. Morning light spilled in through the slightly crooked back window, catching on the steam rising from pots and the flour dust floating in the air. Maria moved through the narrow space like a small storm, dark hair pinned back, sleeves rolled, barking orders and jokes in the same breath. Emily had learned to move with her, stirring stew, rolling biscuit dough, washing an endless river of dishes. Her hands had new calluses now, different from the ones earned on the farm. At the end of each long day, her back ached, but the ache came from work that kept Lily fed and warm, not from bracing against blows. "You're getting fast," Maria said one morning as Emily flipped eggs on the iron skillet. "Another month, and I'll have to start paying you more before you run off and open your own place." Emily smiled, a real, unguarded smile that still surprised her when she felt it. "Let me figure out how not to burn the bacon first," she said. "You don't burn it," Maria replied. "You give it character." After the hearing, Judge Langley had made it clear that Emily and Lily were free to stay in town as long as they wished. At first, they'd kept to the storage room, the crates and blankets forming a makeshift nest. But, with her wages and Maria's quiet help, Emily had managed to rent a small weathered cabin on the edge of Silver Ridge by early April, a one-room place with a lean-to kitchen, a tiny porch, and a yard just big enough to hold a few hopeful plants. The first night they slept there, Lily had lain awake on her narrow cot, staring at the low ceiling. "It's quiet," she whispered. Emily, in the other bed, listened to the silence, the ordinary creaks of wood settling, an owl far off in the trees, and realized her daughter was right. No slurred shouting, no sudden crashes. The quiet felt unfamiliar and good and fragile all at once. "It's our quiet," she whispered back. "We get to decide what fills it." Lily had rolled toward her, doll in hand. "Can we fill it with stories?" "As many as you like," Emily had said. By day, when Emily wasn't in the kitchen, Lily went to school. Miss Finch, the school teacher, was a slender woman in her late 20s with pale hair pinned into a careful bun and dresses that were always a season out of fashion, but spotless. She had a calm voice that could carry across a room without ever seeming to shout, and a way of listening that made even the most tongue-tied child want to try. In Miss Finch's classroom, 4 rows of desks, a pot-belly stove, a map of the United States curling at the corners, Lily learned more than sums and spelling. She learned the habit of raising her hand instead of flinching, the feel of paper under her pencil as she drew houses that didn't shake apart and skies that weren't full of storms. One afternoon after class, Miss Finch stopped Emily at the door. "She's bright," the teacher said, resting a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "She draws things other students don't think to notice." Her eyes were kind. "She's starting to laugh in lessons. I thought you'd like to know." Emily had walked home that day feeling like she'd been given a gift she couldn't quite hold without dropping, this new, unfolding version of her daughter. Jake watched all of this from a half-step back, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to stand any closer. He spent the winter finishing odd jobs around town, repairing a barn roof here, mending a fence there, helping Tom with a frozen lock-up door when the latch rusted shut. As the roads cleared, talk started in the saloon and at the livery about trails opening up to the south, about work on ranches in New Mexico or Arizona, about warmer places where a man's bones didn't feel like they'd turn to ice every January. Jake listened. The old restlessness stirred. He'd never stayed in one place this long since leaving the army. Movement had become his way of not looking too closely at the past. One evening, as he checked the worn leather of his saddle behind the livery stable, Sheriff Tom wandered over, hat pushed back on his head, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Heard you asking about the southern trails," Tom said. "Just keeping options open," Jake replied, running a hand over his horse's neck. The mare, a sturdy bay with a white star on her forehead, nudged his shoulder companionably. Tom studied him. "You planning on telling Emily if you ride out?" Jake's jaw worked. "Don't know what good it'd do," he said. "She and Lily seem to be doing fine. Got a roof, got work. Judge on their side now." "Uh-huh," Tom said. "And none of that has anything to do with the fellow who hauled them off a mountain and stood in front of a drunk with fists the size of hams." Jake didn't answer. Tom sighed. "I ain't giving you orders, Walker. Lord knows you don't take those well anymore. Just, sometimes staying put is braver than heading for the horizon." He gave the horse an absent pat and walked back toward town. The thing with Derek came a week later, on a cool, bright morning that smelled of damp earth and new leaves. For a while after the hearing, Derek had kept a sullen distance. Word around town said he'd tried to keep his head down, showing up to the mine on time, hands steady enough to handle a pick. But the bottle had its own gravity, and Derek had never been good at resisting it. On that morning, Emily and Lily were walking back from the market. A sack of flour balanced on Emily's hip, Lily carrying a bundle of carrots so big she had to use both arms. The sun was warm on their faces. Birds made tentative noise in the budding trees, as if testing whether winter was truly gone. They had just turned onto the quieter lane that led to their small house when a figure stepped out from behind a woodpile ahead. Derek. He looked rougher than he had at the hearing. His eyes were red-rimmed, cheeks patchy, jaw dark with several days' growth. The coat he'd worn to court hung open, one sleeve missing a button. There was a slump in his shoulders, a kind of desperate sagging that even anger couldn't entirely hide. He said. His voice had the shaky edge of a man who had been drinking long enough to dull his better sense, but not long enough to numb his regrets. "We need to talk." Emily stopped, every muscle in her body going taut. Lily pressed against her side, fingers biting into the fabric of her skirt. "You're not supposed to be here," Emily said quietly. The judge doesn't live in my house," Derek cut in. "He doesn't wake up alone there. He doesn't have to look at the empty chair at the table." His gaze dropped to Lily and his face twisted. "That's my little girl. You can't just erase me." "You did that yourself," Emily said before she could swallow the words. Her voice trembled but did not break. "We warned you." Derek's eyes flicked up, and for a heartbeat she saw something familiar in them. The hurt, the helplessness that had once made her want to patch everything over, to smooth and soothe and excuse. Then his mouth hardened. "You put them up to it," he said. "That drifter, that sheriff, the whole town turning against me because of your stories." He took a step forward. Emily backed up automatically, nearly stumbling over Lily. "Stop," she said. "You're breaking the court order." "Court order be damned," he spat. "That's my child. You think some paper's going to keep me from seeing her?" His hand shot out, fingers closing around Emily's wrist with old, bruising force. Lily cried out, carrots spilling from her arms, orange rolling into the road. "Let go of her!" The shout came not from Jake, who was still across town, but from the corner porch of the nearest house. Mrs. Grace Holloway was standing there, apron on over her dress, gray hair unraveling from its bun. She held a broom like a spear. "I've had enough," she said, voice ringing down the lane. "Tom," she called, louder now. "Sheriff, over here." Years of listening to that man's drunken rants must have been building to this moment. Derek glared at her, but the shout had done its damage. A door farther down slammed open. A boy who helped at the livery ran toward Main Street, feet pounding. Within moments that felt like hours, Sheriff Tom appeared at the end of the lane, moving at a fast walk that was only 1 degree short of a run. He took in the scene, the grip on Emily's wrist, Lily's tear-streaked face, the distance from town that a shout could still carry, and his jaw clenched. "Derek," he said, "take your hand off her, now." Derek hesitated, then dropped Emily's wrist as if it burned. The skin underneath was already reddening. "I just wanted to talk," he muttered. "She won't even let me say goodbye." "You can say whatever you need to in a letter," Tom replied. His voice had lost all its easy drawl. "You were warned what would happen if you came near them." He reached for the cuffs at his belt. "You're under arrest for violating a court order." The flash of steel on the cuffs seemed to knock something out of Derek. He sagged, then jerked away again. "You can't take my rights," he protested, but it sounded more like pleading than threat now. "Judge can," Tom said, "and likely will after this." He led Derek away under the watching eyes of the lane's few neighbors. Grace came down from her porch and helped Emily gather up escaped carrots with hands that shook only slightly. "You did right, leaving," Grace said softly, handing Lily a dirt-dusted carrot. "Don't let anyone make you doubt that." 2 days later, Judge Langley convened a brief, grim hearing with far fewer curious onlookers. The facts were simple. Derek had been ordered to stay away. He hadn't. Whatever petition he might have hoped to file about custody evaporated in the face of his own disregard for the law. "This court formally revokes Mr. Derek Carter's claim to custody," Langley ruled. "Visitation, if it's ever considered in the future, will be supervised and contingent on demonstrated sobriety and compliance with orders." He looked tired as he said it, like a man who had seen too many variations of the same story. After that, Derek's presence in town diminished to a shadow. Rumors said he was working longer shifts at the mine, or maybe planning to try his luck elsewhere. For Emily and Lily, his absence was a door finally closing, and spring properly arrived. The Silver Ridge Spring Fair had started as an excuse to sweep winter out of people's bones. By late May, bunting and faded reds and blues fluttered from porch rails. Stalls lined Main Street, tables borrowed from every kitchen in town, draped with quilts, displaying pies, jars of preserves, darts for prizes, jars of guessing beans. A local fiddler and a banjo player shared a makeshift stage by the well, sawing and plucking their way through songs that made boots tap and skirts swish. Children shrieked with delight as they raced stubby-legged ponies in a cordoned-off lane, adults cheering them on as if they were thoroughbreds. Someone had managed to get their hands on colored paper, and confetti fluttered down now and then when a particularly enthusiastic group of boys decided the air wasn't festive enough yet. Maria's booth was a magnet. Trays of sweet rolls, pots of coffee, a mountain of tamales that vanished faster than she could unwrap them. Emily moved behind her, ladling stew into bowls, her hair braided back, a light blue dress, one of Maria's old ones, altered to fit, hugging her more comfortably than any Sunday dress she'd worn before. "You look like spring herself," Maria said, approving. Emily laughed, a sound that made a couple of nearby men glance over in surprise. They weren't used to hearing her laugh like that. Near the schoolhouse, Miss Finch had organized an exhibit of the children's drawings. Sheets of paper fluttered on lines strung between posts held by wooden clothespins. Houses, mountains, rivers, horses, stick-figure families, Silver Ridge seen through small, earnest eyes. Jake drifted through the fair like a man between worlds. He had his saddle roll already packed back at the livery, his mare brushed and ready. The plan, or what passed for one in his life, was to leave the next morning, hit the southern trail while the passes were clear. But his feet kept taking him where the music was, where Maria's stew smelled familiar, where Emily's laughter snagged his attention whether he wanted it to or not. He found himself near the art line just as Miss Finch called for quiet. "Each of you chose one picture to talk about," she told the children gathered at her skirts. "Who's first?" Lily's hand shot up before Emily could worry about whether she'd be too shy. Miss Finch smiled. "All right, Miss Lily, come tell us about yours." Lily walked forward, braids bouncing, blue ribbon slipping a little free. She stopped in front of a drawing in the middle of the line and pointed. "This is my house," she said, voice small but steady. The crowd of adults nearby edged closer, smiling. The picture showed a simple cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, a tree beside it with new leaves drawn in careful green strokes. In front stood 3 figures, a woman in a dress, a girl holding a doll, and a taller man with a hat, one hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. The sky above them was clear and bright, no storm clouds in sight. "That's me," Lily said, tapping the small figure, "and Mama, and Jake." The name hung in the air like a bell. Heads turned, seeking him out. Lily went on, unaware of the ripple she'd caused. "This is our new family," she said simply. "We're planting a tree so it can grow with us. Miss Finch says trees can live a long, long time." Emily's hand went to her mouth. She hadn't seen the picture finished. The room in her chest that had been slowly expanding these past months widened another impossible inch. Jake felt like someone had knocked the air out of him. He stared at the drawing, the little crayon version of himself, hat and all, and felt something shift under his ribs. He had never planned on being drawn into anyone's picture like that again. He had spent years arranging his life so he could ride away before anyone had time to expect him to stay. Yet here he was, rendered in a child's simple lines as part of a new family. The words rang in his head. After the art show, as music picked up again and children scattered toward the pony lane, Jake found Emily standing at the edge of the fairground, watching Lily chase a swirl of confetti. The late afternoon sun painted everything in a softer light, dust motes turning to sparks in the air. "You saw it," Emily said without turning. "Hard to miss," Jake replied. He came to stand beside her, hat in hand. "Kids are honest in ways grown folks forget." "She didn't ask me first," Emily murmured. There was no anger in her voice, only wonder and a trace of fear. "She just drew what's in her heart." Jake looked at her profile, the way the breeze lifted a few escaped strands of hair, the lines at the corners of her eyes that were slowly smoothing as sleep and peace reclaimed them. "I was planning on riding south," he said. Tomorrow. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her shawl. I figured, she managed. But I can't stop thinking about that picture, he continued. About that tree she drew. About how many times I've planted my boots in new dirt only to pull them up again before anything had a chance to take root. He swallowed. I'm tired, Emily. Tired of running from ghosts and mistakes and the man I used to be. She turned to face him fully now. What are you saying, Jake? He met her gaze, gray eyes steady despite the way his heart hammered. I'm saying, if you'll have me, slow, careful, no promises I can't keep, I'd like to try staying, here, with you and Lily. He exhaled. I'd like to see what it's like to build something instead of just patching what's broken and moving on. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of all the nights spent sharing stories in the storeroom, all the mornings he'd walked Lily to school, all the moments when their eyes had met across Maria's kitchen and then darted away again. I don't know how to do this, Emily admitted. Every promise I ever trusted turned into something sharp. We learn it together, Jake said. And if one of us needs to walk out to the porch and breathe when the ghosts get too loud, we let them. But we walk back in after. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. What about the South? The work? He gave a small shrug. There's work everywhere a man's willing to use his hands. Seems to me there's enough that needs doing right here. Lily, noticing them at last, came running, cheeks flushed, a paper flower crown askew on her head. Mama, Jake, she panted. They're going to start the kids' race again. Come, see? Jake glanced at Emily, a question in his eyes. She nodded. Go on, she said. We'll both be here when you come back. That evening, as the fair wound down and lanterns began to flicker on along Main Street, the three of them walked back to the little cabin on the edge of town. In Jake's hand was a spindly maple sapling he'd bought from a farmer who'd brought a wagon full of them to sell. Its roots were wrapped in damp burlap, leaves just budding. They dug a hole together in the soft earth of the yard, Jake breaking the ground, Emily steadying the thin trunk, Lily patting dirt back into place with her small palms. What shall we name it? Lily asked. You want to name a tree? Jake said, amused. Miss Finch says some people do, Lily replied seriously. It helps them remember to take care of it. Emily thought for a moment. How about Hope? She suggested. Lily nodded, satisfied. Hope it is. They stood back and looked at the little maple, its few leaves trembling in the evening breeze. It didn't look like much yet, just a skinny stick in the dirt. But, given time, given care, it might one day throw shade across the whole yard, branches strong enough for a swing or a child's climbed perch. Families are like that too, Emily thought, though she didn't say it aloud. Fragile at first, needing tending, growing in directions you didn't always expect. Jake slid his hand, tentative but sure, into hers. She let her fingers curl around his. Lily slipped her small hand into Emily's other one, making a lopsided chain. Under the soft blue of the 1910 spring evening, in a town that had watched them fall apart and slowly knit themselves back together, they stood in front of a tiny tree and felt something new take root. A family not born from blood alone, but from courage. The courage to leave, to tell the truth, to stay. In the end, Emily, Lily, and Jake remind us that even after the coldest winter of our lives, God can still lead us into spring. Courage is not about pretending we are not afraid. It is about taking one small step away from violence, away from shame, away from the past that hurt us, and trusting that God will open a new door. Sometimes family is not just the people we are born to, but the people who stand beside us, protect us, and choose us again and again. If you are going through hard days, I pray this story reminds you that you are not alone. It is never weak to ask for help. It is never wrong to run toward safety. God sees every tear, every sleepless night, and He is able to bring healing, justice, and a new beginning, just like He did for Emily and Lily. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment. Tell me what part spoke to you the most. And do not forget to subscribe so you do not miss the next story. May God bless you and your family with protection, peace, and a new season of joy after every storm. If you agree, write Amen in the comments.